In this video, we will focus on the request dispatcher interface. So there are lots of questions that you can answer when you study the following content. Now, what is a request dispatcher? Request dispatching, we can forward or we can include the content to another servlet or JSP or an HTML page. So it is a technique that will allow a servlet or a JSP page to dispatch a request to another servlet, another JSP page or a HTML page, which will be responsible for further processing. So where is this request dispatcher interface defined? It is defined in javax.servlet package. So the request dispatcher interface is used for dispatching a request. It defines an object which will receive a request from the browser and send these requests to any other resource. Now, what can be another resource? It can either be a servlet, it can be a JSP, or it can be a HTML file. Now, whenever a request dispatcher object is created, the first question you need to answer it, how do I create it? So there are multiple methods for creating it. The very first method is getRequestDispatcher. Now this method can be called in two ways. One, using servlet context and using servlet request. In practical, we have used servlet request. So we always write request.getRequestDispatcher. Now in this, we are supposed to give the string path. Now which path we will give? We will give the path of the file to which we are supposed to forward the request or to which we are supposed to include. Okay, so that path we will give. Suppose I want to forward to welcome servlet, so I'll write welcome servlet in string path, correct? Now there is another way of creating or getting a request dispatcher object, that is getNamedDispatcher method. We can call this method and we can provide the name of the servlet, or we can give the name of the file to which we want to connect to. Okay, now in case the servlet that is associated, whose name we have given over there, it is not found, what will it do? The method will return null. The method will return null. Now this is how you get the object of the request dispatcher, correct? Once we have the object of the request dispatcher, we can call two methods on it. So if anyone is asking you what are the methods of request dispatcher, your answer must be forward and include. Okay, now what is the forward method? The syntax of the forward method is public void forward servlet request servlet response throws servlet exception IO exception. Now this method will forward a request from a servlet to another resource. Now that another resource may be a servlet, it may be a JSP file, or it may be a HTML file. Similarly, the include method has exactly the same syntax. But obviously the working of both the methods is different. The include method includes the content of the resource in the response. It doesn't forward. It will include the content of a resource in the response. So वो जो दूसरा resource है उसका content पहले response में include हो जाता है. Okay, rest of the syntax is exactly the same. You just replace forward with the word include. Now let us see it example wise. Request dispatcher RD. I want to create the object of request dispatcher, right? Is equal to request dot get request dispatcher, and I am writing the name of the file to which I want to connect. So I want to connect to welcome servlet. So I am writing welcome servlet. RD dot forward request comma response, or RD dot include request comma response. Whatever method you want to call, you can call over here. Now, obviously these are the two methods, but how can I explain the methods with an help of example? So let us quickly consider it. I have created a login form over here. Okay, and on the submit button I will be going to the login servlet. Now when I go to the login servlet, what I'll do is I will check if my password is equal to servlet. And if the password is equal to servlet, I'll create a request dispatcher object and I will forward my request to the welcome servlet. And in case the password is not equal to servlet, then I'll still create a request dispatcher object, but I will include the output of index.html in my response. I'll include the output of index.html in my response. So here, once I'm calling the forward method, and at another point in time I'm calling the include method. Okay, and then the code for welcome servlet is written over here. You can see this code. Now the question is there any difference between the include and the forward method? The answer is yes. What is the difference between the include and forward method? If anyone is asking you what is the difference or anyone is asking you ki how does include and how does forward work, then in that case you are supposed to give this answer. This answer applies for both. How does include work? How does forward work? Or differentiate between include and forward method. Okay, so in both the cases this answer will apply. Now the first point is the definition. Include method allows including the content that is produced by another resource. Now that another resource may be a servlet, JSP or HTML file. In our case, in our example, what was the another resource? It was index.html. Remember, we are calling index.html over here. We are including it in the calling servlet's response. So who is our calling servlet? Our calling servlet is login servlet. So let us say servlet 1. So servlet 1 में include करना है. क्या include करना है? दूसरे सर्वलेट JSP या HTML का रिस्पॉन्स. सो सर्वलेट 2 का रिस्पॉन्स इंक्लूड होना चाहिए. किस में इंक्लूड होना चाहिए? सर्वलेट 1 में. ओके, अभी फॉरवर्ड क्या करता है? फॉरवर्ड मेथड अलाउज फॉरवर्डिंग द रिक्वेस्ट टू अनदर सर्वलेट JSP और HTML फाइल ऑन द सर्वर. नाउ दिस रिसोर्स जिसको हम लोग ने रिक्वेस्ट फॉरवर्ड किया है विल टेक ओवर द रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी फॉर प्रोड्यूसिंग द रिस्पॉन्स. सो फॉर एग्जाम्पल सर्वलेट 1 ने फॉरवर्ड किया सर्वलेट 2 को, तो अभी रिस्पॉन्स कौन जनरेट करेगा? सर्वलेट 2. सर्वलेट 2 विल टेक ओवर द रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी ऑफ प्रोड्यूसिंग द रिस्पॉन्स. ओके, नाउ वट एवर आई हैव एक्सप्लेन्ड यू, द सेम थिंग यू मे राइट इन द एग्जाम्पल. ओके, नाउ to include the response of one servlet into another, I can use include method. फॉरवर्ड कब यूज होगा? जब एक सर्वलेट प्रिलिमिनरी प्रोसेसिंग कर लेता है एंड इट वांट्स अनदर सर्वलेट, अनदर फाइल टू कंप्लीट द फर्दर प्रोसेसिंग और टू कंप्लीट द जनरेशन ऑफ द रिस्पॉन्स. देन यू विल जस्ट फॉरवर्ड कि मैंने यहाँ तक किया, अब तू आगे का देख ले. ऐसा जब आपको बोलना होता है देन फॉरवर्ड. ओके, नाउ the syntax of include and syntax of forward we have already seen. It is very simple. Public void include, servlet request, servlet response, throws, servlet exception, IO exception. Forward का क्या है syntax? Public void forward, servlet request, servlet response, throws, servlet exception, IO exception. Again, the example is same as I have given you in the code above. So you do something once and you are repeating it in multiple times in different questions. Okay, so remember this. Now, the next point that we have to see is access to the request and response object. Now, the servlet that is targeted in the include method has access to everything in the request object. But the use of response object is very limited. The use of response object is very limited. It does not have complete access to the response object. Whereas in the case of forward method, the targeted servlet, that is your servlet 2, has access to all the aspects of request as well as response object. तो जो भी रिसोर्स को आप बुलाना चाहते हो ना, जैसे वेलकम सर्वलेट हो या index.html फाइल हो, उसको इंक्लूड जब यूज होता है तो रिक्वेस्ट का पूरा एक्सेस होता है, रिस्पॉन्स का आधा एक्सेस होता है. वेराज फॉरवर्ड मेथड में रिक्वेस्ट का भी पूरा एक्सेस होता है एंड रिस्पॉन्स का भी पूरा एक्सेस होता है. ओके, नाउ What is a limitation? It can only write the information to the servlet output stream or the writer of the response object and commit a response by writing the content past the end of the response buffer or by explicitly calling the flush buffer method of the servlet response interface. So अगर आपको कोई information लिखना है, then only you can do that much. Okay? Forward का limitation क्या है? The forward method should be called before the response has been committed to the client, because any uncommitted response is cleared out when the forward method is called. Okay, so if you want to send any response, you have to send the response to the client first and then only you call the forward method. Now URL. The include method of the request dispatcher can be called anytime. Okay. The requested object passed to the target object will have its request URL path and other URL path parameters adjusted to reflect the target URL. Means what? When the request object is passed, the URL is changed in case of the forward method. It takes up the URL of the targeted servlet, that is servlet 2. Whereas it will reflect, in the case of include, it will reflect the old URL only. It will show the URL of the calling servlet, that is your servlet 1. Request कहाँ से generate हुआ? Servlet 1 से generate हुआ, तो include में servlet 1 का ही URL दिखाया जाएगा. Okay? Now, use of status code or header. In case of forward method, we can use the status code, we can set the status code, we can set the headers. But in case of include method, because the path and other parameters are not changing, it is still, it is still showing you the data of servlet 1. The calling servlet. You cannot change the response status code, you cannot change the headers. Even if you try to change, it will be ignored. Okay? Now, because you cannot work with headers, you cannot work with cookies in the include method. Whereas in the forward method, whenever you are forwarding from one page to another page, you can easily work with cookies. Now, let us have a look at the diagram. Now, in case of include, you can see the client request is going from servlet 1 to servlet 2. Servlet 2 is generating the response, but the servlet 2 is sending the response to servlet 1, and servlet 1 will include the servlet 2's response in its own response and send it back to the client. So user को किसका response जाता है? servlet 1 plus 2 का. But भेजता कौन है? servlet 1. Correct? Forward method में क्या होता है? The client sends the request to servlet 1. Servlet 1 will forward the request to servlet 2. Servlet 2 will generate the response and client को किसका response जाता है? servlet 2 का. The client receives the response from servlet 2. That's it for the request dispatcher. You will be able to answer all the questions on request dispatcher with help of the content in this video. Thank you so much.